Hi, Gabe. We're going to take a look at your aesthetics and control posting here. So let's get into the screenshot here and start sharing. All right. So overview, we'll take a look at what we have here. This is a little bit different. Different only in that you are beginning to change orientation of the camera. This is one of the very first vertical images that I've seen a student do. Most, if not all, of the images that students have been doing have been horizontal. And yeah, you're using it effectively, the vertical framework. That's perfectly acceptable as long as you're using it. I would say, however, when you're going to do vertical imagery, it's going to be a good idea to stay consistent with that throughout, particularly later on as you're creating portfolio works, so that the portfolio does not feel as if you got to rotate it and turn it around each time. So if a body of work, for instance, a series of work or something like that, if they're all vertical, that works really well. If they go vertical, horizontal, vertical, and they're different shapes all over the place, it's sort of like reading a book where each time you turn the page, it's a different font and maybe even a different size font. The words all could be consistent and work together, but it just is disorienting that way. Not a problem here. You're just exploring, but just something to bear in mind as you move forward with your work. Your exposures look fine. You're shooting in color here. I said you guys could shoot in color or black and white. Gets a little bit dark here and there. I think you mentioned it in your essay there that you wrote at the end, that I think your last image you were sort of unhappy with because you let it be too dark. So your exposures overall, I think, are pretty good. I think over here, I'm observing these images are a little dull. In other words, they lack a bit of luminosity. That's going to be your focal length, the 85. These lack a little bit of luminosity, a lot of luminosity. There's not a whole lot of brightness going on to them. Minor thing, again, we take a look at those things just in terms of craft to see where you are with it. So anyway, let's go into the hold or not to hold. With these projects, as we work through them, it's interesting to see where students are. Sometimes students start off really strong and then they get a little bit weak in the middle, or they get a little bit like, the images are okay, and then they wind up strong again. Some students, they start off sort of floundering a little bit, trying to figure stuff out. And by the time they get to the end, they're making amazing imagery. I think you started off pretty well here. I mean, some of this stuff, it works really well to incorporate movement in the photo. Part of the challenge here is to not just to take pictures that are at a variety of shutter speed, but incorporate the characteristics of shooting at that shutter speed within those photos. This gets a little bit dark. I say a little bit because I think you can get away with this sometimes. It just gets away from you just a little bit. I think if we were just a half step brighter, just a little bit, that this would have been feeling like it's dark and ominous, yet still felt like it had an exposure that was satisfying. This one gets a little bit dark, just a little bit. So I think it could actually be corrected a little bit in Photoshop. We're not doing Photoshop in the class, but I think this image would be a good candidate for, well, we can correct it, a minor exposure issue, which this has in Photoshop, to bring out the tones and values of it. But just know to the professional eye, this one's a little dark. So is this one a little dark? The way we can tell is that the shadow areas are lacking texture. We want a little bit of texture, and these are missing a little bit of texture. Not a lot of texture, but a little bit of texture. So they get away from you just a little bit. So I like that you're pushing the edge. You're trying to see how you can kind of make these things work. So keep doing that. That's a healthy thing. Just giving you those observations so that you'll know, okay, so maybe this one got a little bit darker. Maybe these are a little bit light. Now, this one is high key, but I think it works because they're not so high key. The whites here, where you got the super bright here, it's not so super bright that it's like glaring in your face. And even though you don't have a perfectly dark, it still reads as a complete and satisfying exposure because of the nature of it. Now, when you do this movement here, you've obliterated any kind of rendering whatsoever. Here we can still see a little bit of a remnant of where the bones are. And these are the choices that you make. If you were doing an event or something like that, where you would want to maybe capture like a musical event and you wanted to capture just a shadow of a person and then have the rest of it moving, this would be a really good technique to use. If you were doing something that required a complete abstraction, you just want it to really feel like it was just pure energy, like at a carnival or something like that, this might be a good technique. So even though these are very abstract and this was an experiment, they're not totally lost in terms of the professional application of them. So as we continue through these, you can see that the middle ground is the one where they tend to look a little bit more awkward, the 15th of a second thing. And you have to make a decision like, what do I do with those? Do you exaggerate the movement by moving the camera very quickly? Do you try to hold it more steady? Do you hold it steady and kind of do a little flick of the camera? This is where it becomes a little bit more difficult because it's neither blurry nor in focus. So this is to demonstrate that there are in-between areas that are just unsatisfying unless you really get lucky with them. And so that's what ends up happening when you get into this sort of realm. Now we're into the how deep, and what we should be seeing here is the depth of field gradually increasing or decreasing. Here in this case, I think you put your small aperture first, and then you went open, open, open. I can see, however, for some reason, your exposure is changing a little bit as we do this. That might be a result of something your camera is trying to compensate for. I'm not exactly sure. I'd have to look to see what's going on there. Visually, what we expect to happen is happening. It's getting shallower and shallower depth of field. So that is happening here. You'll notice, though, at the longer focal length, the shallow depth of field is exaggerated. So I think, let's see, kind of come back out here. What we're going to notice is, I think you were using, this one's 85. Did you, 135. Here, we should see, now, for some reason, these images are small. I don't know why they're rendering as small on the screen here. But your shallow depth of field is going to be more exaggerated the longer the focal length is. Sports photographers and action photographers, they're going to use very long focal lengths, of course, because they're on the sideline or they're on the outskirts of the action, and they're trying to bring the action closer to them. So they're using these very long lenses, these lenses of 600, 1200 millimeter lenses, and larger than that even. They have their own tripods. They're so big. And then they're using wide open apertures that are really, really open, so that they can get fast shutter speeds so that they can capture all the action. Well, what they're also getting is something that's good, is they're able to slice off a really thin depth of field so they can sort of really pick what they're trying to highlight. So instead of like everything, they can focus in on just maybe the one player who has the ball, or the one horse that they're trying to make the photograph in that are running, down the field or something. So the longer focal lengths, you should see a more exaggerated version. I'm interested in discovering what's going on with your camera, why we're getting this variation. You should not be getting this dramatic. Should be getting a little bit of a variation perhaps, but the difference between this and this is pretty dramatic in terms of how much it changes as far as the exposure. Kind of dramatic. So something's up with that. I don't know exactly what it is there. Now we have the equivalent exposures here, where you're attempting to do the sliding. This is more of a math problem. There's really not a whole lot of middle ground to it. You either got it or you didn't get it. You either solved the little sort of puzzle, or you didn't solve the puzzle. this was really just to introduce you to the concept of this reciprocal relationship of these controls, that if you move in one direction, you got to move in the other direction in order to compensate. And that when you're working in manual mode, which you might oftentimes find yourself doing that, you need to be able to understand that balance so that you can manipulate it to your own aesthetic, because you might want to overexpose a little bit or make it a little bit brighter than normal or a little bit darker than normal on purpose. And in that case, you need to be in manual mode because your camera will always try to compensate for you to get that ideal exposure. But if you're trying to deliberately make it not, you might need to get into that manual mode in order to do that. So this was just to introduce you to that. And then in this case, it's just what I'm looking at is, okay, did they get the math problem correct? Looks like you did. You have a little bit, again, of variation here. I'm not sure, again, why. Because you had a variation in the depth of field, I'm going to guess that there's something going on inside your camera there. When you switch to these shutter speeds, maybe there's an inconsistency that's happening. I don't know. But that's where that is happening. Now, with these images, it looks like you're having a bit of fun. You're creating these sort of geometric sort of patterns, or not geometric, these shape-based patterns. And I think it's very good. I mean, you're using short lighting in some cases, reflectors, all of that, just really kind of experimenting and seeing what you can do overall with the imagery. I think this one is quite good for a lot of reasons. You're using the entire picture plane. We've got what looks like a combination of color, where you have a clean color in the foreground and the background looks like it gets a little bit warm. So that might mean you're using a different color range, or it might just mean that the colors of the bones were slightly varied when you use them. That gives a real point of view, almost like a voyeuristic look. I agree with you on this one. A reflector would have been good, maybe not even an extra light, just a reflector to have highlighted that just a little bit. Remember, when we're using the entire picture plane, we create what's called a dynamic composition. It means our eye is going to go all the way around the composition. And you're doing that in these last ones. And this one, you're doing it as well with this equivalent exposure. But when we have stuff like this, where it's just an object on the table, it becomes just an object on the table. And don't forget that when you're making your photographs, they deserve to have beautiful compositions every single time. And I know you're able to do that. And I know you have the eye for it because I see it over and over again in a lot of your photography. So just remember that as you're moving forward with taking pictures. Hopefully, yeah, hopefully you have been sort of picking up on a lot of these things as we get out into the field, into the on location stuff. There's other things you have to consider. The weather, the sun is moving, so the light is constantly changing. This is why we don't do the location thing first. We have you doing this a little bit later. That way you can compensate with the information that you know. I want you to look a lot before you start making these images. And then, we'll see where you are, and then we'll attempt to reproduce these in the studio afterward. So that's what I have for you. Hopefully you'll have an excellent time on location next week, and we'll see you afterward. All right. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.